This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. It's time to talk about draft. It's time to really get into it now that the combine has passed, and I brought in BRENT SOBOLEWSKI. He is an NFL analyst for Bleacher Report, BR Scouting Department, all of that stuff. Check him out on Twitter. BRENT SOBOLEWSKI also goes by Sobo. I was supposed to get up with you at the Senior Bowl. We didn't have time to really link up at that time. My question for you is somebody who does this for Bleacher Report and your scouting department. How does the draft board actually change from the Senior Bowl to the combine? How much does it change based on things that you see at the combine versus things that you see at the Senior Bowl, and things that you hear in between that, as far as your individual, not what you're hearing, but your individual evaluation of players? What can really affect that in that meantime? Because I think we see a lot of players who they end the season or they end the Senior Bowl and they have a good Senior Bowl and they end up looking like they're going to be a second-round pick, and then you get to the draft and somehow they're like a forefront, like DeJuan Jones, right? We kind of know what happened there because he didn't show up for the other 2 days of the Senior Bowl. Yeah. But there's guys like that every year where you're like, oh, yeah, that guy should be a day 2 pick, and then it's like day 3, round 6, and you're like, the guy's still there.
Well, when you look at the process, one of the things we take a pride in discuss internally quite often is how we are going to build out our draft board and our approach, right? I think that's important. There's multiple different ways to approach the NFL draft, right? There's pure evaluation, there is inside information, there is a combination of the two, and so on and so forth. It just depends on what you believe in as an individual and as an organization. Now, for us at the Bleacher Report, the scouting department, we look at it from an evaluation standpoint. We have very influential voices as our scouts. Derek Clausen is brilliant when it comes to about talking about quarterbacks, a young rising star in this industry. Brandon Thorne is one of the most influential voices in offensive line and social media. He's the one that evaluates our big boys. Matt Holder is someone that's played at the collegiate level, does defensive front seven for us. And Corey Giddings is our secondary scout, and he used to work for the New York Giants as an NFL scout. So he has that experience as well. So for us, it's about that evaluation. And to your point, all of us were in attendance in Mobile and all of us were in attendance in Indianapolis. So they're data points, right? You're taking into account what you see personally and what is applicable to the evaluation, whether it's seeing a quarterback throw it live for the first time, since we're not on the road year round like typical NFL scouts. It'd be nice if we were, but hey, this is the media industry, not exactly a $1 billion NFL franchise. Then at the same time, how do they perform against other top talent? Do they rise to the occasion? Do they improve throughout the week? Do they look like the prospect you evaluated on tape? Once you come out of those situations, at least from the Senior Bowl, then you start to adjust. And the adjustment isn't drastic. It might be some movement up a few spots, down a few spots, but you're never going to see a guy go multiple rounds, as an example. Sometimes you're seeing a guy for a first time. And I mean, let's be honest, some of these small school guys, you just can't, it's hard to get your hands on tape. And that gives you a much cleaner look at them based on a higher level of competition. Now, once you get to the NFL Combine, it becomes a opportunity to either confirm or deny what you saw on tape. So you see a guy run faster than you expected, or you see a guy run slower than expected. Keon Coleman's a great example. We had Keon Coleman as a top 15 pick during the season. He has slowly gone down the board slightly to the point where he's probably back end of the first round, but it's not been drastic, and it wasn't just based off of 4.6 40. It was the second half of his season, inconsistencies, and then you get that 4.6 40.
Which you ends up being the big thing that kind of people point to.
Exactly.
It's a lot of things.
But to my point about data points, right? You also have to not just look at one thing, right? He had the fastest time miles per hour during the gauntlet. Do you know who had it last year?
No, who had it?
Puka Nacua. to give you an idea. So you have to all of this, right? One thing I say constantly is evaluations never stop up until the day of draft. If something comes up, you take it into consideration and you make the best decision based on all the available information. And as a media member, we fall a little short of that because one, we don't have all the medical information. Two, we don't get to sit in with these meetings with teams. And three, a lot of these teams' boards are much smaller than the generalized boards that we get to discuss. But with that said,
Mhm.
we do our best attempt at evaluating these guys fairly based on what we see through tape, what we see personally, and all the data points along the way.
Now there are some positions I think that are just trickier to get a hold of, or they're more like wide receiver seems like one where there's a lot of landmines that you can fall on, right? Like the 40-yard dash can sometimes be a landmine where you see a guy run a 40 and maybe the energy of that guy running that 40 kind of takes that guy to a higher place or puts him in a different light to general managers than maybe he probably should have been. Like, do you find wide receiver to be one of those spots? Because like that's the one where you look at the guys who have really like flailed out of the first round, like Kevin White, John Ross, and somebody else we were talking about. Like guys don't even make it to the conversation of fifth year option. Like usually, like if you draft a bad tackle, like Chance Warmack was a bad guard, right? Or somebody we thought was a generational guard ended up just kind of being pretty average, still had an NFL career. But these, like when they go wide receiver, I feel like they have a higher chance of like, this dude's like pretty much out the league before like 5 years of his contract elapses. What do you think goes into that? Like, why do you think that that position can sometimes feel like it has such a high burn rate when it comes to trying to predict what makes? Because there's these guys, sometimes they're fast, they can't get
Mhm.
open, right? Or sometimes they're slow, like Jarvis Landry, they can find a way to get open, right? Up until like 10 years into their career. So, what how do you gauge all of this, right? With all, because it's not one to one. Like, we'll see a guy
No.
run fast and we think that's going to make him a great wide receiver. But you look at the best wide receivers in the NFL, those 40 times are different, like for every
Yeah.
guy up there.
Well, we talk about prioritization and how you evaluate and what you're looking at. So, yeah, you're absolutely correct in stating people get overly excited about 40-yard dash time, straight line speed, when in reality that is less applicable to what you do on the football field than how do you create separation in short areas. And so you look at a guy like Lad McConkey, who isn't your typical X receiver. Most people have him basically at slot receiver, even though he is capable of playing on the outside and probably will some in the NFL. He is his ability to break off, sink his hips, break off his routes, and create speed directly or instantaneously allows him to create that type of separation. And the guys you mentioned, Kevin White, or we can throw in like a Devontae Parker, these guys had
Mm.
immense physical skills, but they were straight line athletes who really struggled to create that separation because they lack the other areas in the position that's really necessary to succeed in the NFL. So I I want to. I'm not going to use wide receivers as an example. I want to use an old Browns reference in how an elite talent didn't test well, but one of the things you looked at showed that he was truly an elite player, and that's Joe Hayden. Do you remember
Mm.
when Joe Hayden ran a 4.6 ish? Now I know reports came out later that it was his back, blah blah blah, whatever.
Yeah.
Well, if you watched him on tape, Joe Hayden had one of the most fluid lower bodies you will ever see in a cornerback prospect. His ability to open up his hips, turn and run allowed him, whether he was slower or not, to always maintain with bigger, faster wide receivers. It's where he was really great as a player. And so when you're evaluating that aspect and place less emphasis on your static runs and things you see during the NFL combine, then that's where you will see a differentiation between players that are more successful and those who aren't. And that's really what it comes down to. I mentioned the Coleman example, right? Cameron Kitchens in this year's class. Now he's a safety. He ran very poorly. His RAS, relative athletic score, was very low. Then you watched him on the field during positional drills, and he was absolutely outstanding. So it's what you weigh, it's what you prioritize, and how you evaluate, and that varies. It varies from team to team, scout to scout, and media outlet from media outlet. So you have to take that all into consideration when it comes to these players and how we're looking at them compared to others.
Yeah. Real quick before we get into some of the Brown specific stuff in here. Do you think with everything that's available now, like all the tools that we have, all the different tests that we have, all the different numbers now that we have, that it can sometimes get a little bit too much that people forget that the question we're trying to answer is, can this dude play football? Like,
Analysis by or paralysis by analysis,
yeah,
right?
or it's like you get so lost in the sauce where it's like, what are we actually trying to answer, right? Like, you lose
Yeah.
the original thesis. And I think that's a great point you made, where it's like, hey, you do have to go back and be like, hey, that's great. Can he play football though? Like, because Anthony Schwartz is a great example of like, I mean, he had less than 500 yards, and if you add up his Auburn and his NFL career together, 500 yards of receiving, and that does not indicate somebody who came into the league knowing how to play the wide receiver position at the level that he needed to. And he throw him in the Stefanski offense where he's asked to be on time, asked to catch things in rhythm. Kind of, it just didn't work out for him. So looking at where the Browns are, they brought in a new offensive coordinator, Ken Dorsey. They're trying to change some things around. Um, where do you think they'll go with 55? I think they're going to be more apt to do offensive line if they stick at 55. Honestly, we
Yeah.
we all think they're trading back, right? Like they've done it pretty much every time. But do you think they're going to stay at 55, or do you think they trade back and kind of do what they've done the last couple of years?
Well, I think that trading back is a good point, and the reason I state that is based on the makeup of this year's NFL draft class. It's not made for Andrew Berry. So,
Mm-hmm.
and the reason I state that is, I mean, the first round pick being gone is what it is. I mean, that's how you're building your organization. That's what you decided to do. It's some cost. Once you get past that point, you're looking at an NFL draft that won. Our latest draft board, we did 200 prospects. It was like at 196 that actually had draftable grades. Now there's 200, there's well over 200 picks in this year's draft class. It just announced the compensatory picks, so I can't remember exactly how many the number is this year. But that shows you the overall depth isn't great necessarily in
Mm.
this class. And when the majority of your draft class is in the fifth, sixth, and seventh round, as the Cleveland Browns are, that doesn't bode well. Then you add in the X factor of their age guardrail and a draft class that has the least amount of underclassmen we've seen in the last 10 years, plus a heavy majority of fifth, sixth, and even seventh year seniors. Their draft board, I'm assuming, is probably going to be right around 100 players if the way that they're looking at it this year. So I definitely expect manipulation with the draft to get the best players they can to fit what they prefer. And it's really dependent on who's available when. So I wouldn't be position specific. It's just the guys that they feel that fit all those guardrails that they typically abide very strictly by,
Mm-hmm.
and we know they do. We've seen it, and it's been successful, and I give them credit for that stuff. But at the same time, who actually fits in what? I will say the one position I think they should be solid at and could come out with a player that's far more explosive than what they have right now is another wide receiver. We mentioned it that this year's class that there's certain guys that you really have to evaluate uh, precisely to see if they can actually play in the league. But the overall depth there is almost always going to be deeper than any other position, just because of the 7-on-7 culture that so many of these guys grow up in nowadays, and the ability to do so. So if you're in a second round, for example, I know our mock draft we dropped Tuesday had Jalen McMillan there for the Cleveland Browns. I think would be a great addition. A guy has an RAS well over 9, runs a 4.47, played as a number 3 wide receiver at Washington, but really would have been the guy if he had returned to school this year. So that's just an example of what I'm looking at when I see them based on the situation in which they've been placed.
All right. So, from your perspective, if the Browns can walk away, let's say like a packet of 3 players,
Okay.
from this draft, right? If they could walk away with well, 2 of the 3 guys in this packet, they
Okay.
would have had a successful draft, in your opinion. What are those 3 names?
Oh man, you're going to put me on the spot with specific names, but I got so many to go to. I do like McMillan, but you have other wide receivers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Xavier Worthy, depending on where he goes. I'm not still not sold on him as a complete first round pick, and I know you have that Mitchell Schwartz factor. Man, that shows my throwback there on that one.
Mitchell
The Schwartz
Schwartz.
factor, that wide receiver when it comes to pure speed. I just see certain players capable of producing for them that we
Mm,
haven't seen at the position, right? I said McMillan. If you have a Jalen Polk, he's not the fastest, but he's someone again from Washington that was able to produce. Lab McConkey. Adonai Mitchell has probably worked his way out of that conversation. One of my favorite players in this draft, and a lot of people don't talk about, is Jermaine Burton from Alabama, who really developed as a number one wide receiver this past year and has that juice that you're looking for at the position. So, any of those wide receivers, if you go a little further down, you're looking at a Ricky Pearsall,
Mm.
someone we like. I like Malik Washington personally. He's a little bit older. He's right on that fringe of the age guardrail. So I'm not sure entirely if he's going to be on their board or not. If it's offensive lineman, I think you're trying to settle tackle long term. We know this is a strong tackle class, right? So it just depends on where you project certain guys because some guys will move inside, some don't. One name I think is a bit of a sleeper because he had a thigh injury all year, and he's a Yaley, Ivy Leaguer. Now, granted, it's not Harvard for Cleveland, but he's an Ivy Leaguer. Kieran, I know I always butcher the last name. Kieran Amegdajay, 6'5", 320 pounds, played guard, left tackle for Yale, 4-year starter. So smart kid, obviously. I think someone like that you can bring in, develop. You right now you're set with your top 3 offensive tackles, but a year from now you may have one. So if you can bring in a guy like that, maybe in the 3rd round and develop him, now you don't have Bill Callahan anymore, which is a gigantic blow. And I think people need to realize how big of a deal that is and how good he was. But at the same time, you got to continually invest in the position. You got to,
Mhm.
especially the offensive line. That's one of the positives Cleveland has had for the last few years. They had the deepest offensive line in football. It was really tested last year. It still was good enough to hold up with Callahan and bubblegum at points, but they had the type of guys capable of starting in a pinch. And so I think you keep that up. And if you come away with a wide receiver and offensive tackle, you've had a successful start to your draft and really are building what essentially is around Deshaun Watson. They are all in. It's clear. I don't think anyone can argue otherwise. And so to me, at this point, it is all in with him and bringing in talent, whether it's offensive line, wide receiver, backup tight end, or backup running back, to really start this year's draft class.
All right, Brent. Thanks for being on. Make sure you check out Brent on Bleacher Report. Also on Twitter at Brent BRENTSOBLESKI.
Man,
On
I kept it
Twitter.
simple too. It's just my name.
First name, last name. But thank you for being on here, man. Appreciate you. And are we gonna see you at SummerSlam?
Oh no, I'm an AEW guy. I'm actually
I am
I am.
too. I am
Oh,
too. But I'm
nice.
like, if they're
Okay.
gonna do SummerSlam, I gotta go, right? Like,
Well,
yeah,
understood. Understood. In fact,
yeah.
I was talking. My second child is a huge wrestling fan with me, and we were talking about not going to All In London, which would be amazing,
Mm,
but the wife ixnayed that one. But maybe All Out in Chicago this year to that pay per view. So I'm probably hitting one of the AEW pay per views this year.
definitely, definitely. And this one, and they have it in St. Louis, might be a good one. They have some good stuff planned for there. But thank you for coming on. Appreciate you. Everybody have a great day. Have you a better night. Peace.